A lot of the beliefs that we have in life come from the experiences that we have over the course of our childhood, over the course of our teenage years, over the course of adulthood. That oftentimes in life, facts are harder to remember than experiences. The feelings that we have in certain moments stick with us for our entire lives. And whether we realize it or not, those experiences are molding and shaping our identities. They're molding and shaping our beliefs. They're molding and shaping things that we like and things that we don't like. I'll give you a personal example. I hate flying bugs. Specifically flying bugs that can sting, pretty much all types of flying bugs that can sting. At night, for whatever reason, when we're going to sleep, if there's a mosquito in my room, I cannot sleep. My wife, she can sleep. Why? Because they don't touch her. I don't know what it is about me or her, but she can tell you this is true, not an exaggeration. They are magnetized to me. So they come after me. Same thing with our little baby, our 2-year-old. They go to her too. They leave older brother and sister alone. For whatever reason, there's something about us that they just like to bite. And so I will close my eyes, be going to sleep, and then you hear zzz. So it doesn't matter what time it is, it drives my wife nuts. I will turn on the lights. I will go into full-blown commando mode, looking around. Shh, Lauren, don't say anything. I think I can hear it. I will turn off the air conditioning. I will hunt that thing down until it dies. And then I like to leave it there on the wall. It drives my wife nuts. I'm like, that's there as a warning for any other mosquito that comes along. Say, this is what happens when mosquitoes come inside my house. The reason I think, if I had to put a specific reason that I'm so petrified of flying, biting animals is because when I was a kid, I got stung by a lot of bees all at the same time. So growing up, we were kind of out in the country. We had this bayou that was across the street from our house. And one of our rules at our house, when my parents came up with the proximity of where we were allowed to play and where we weren't allowed to play, one of the rules was you don't go across the bayou. So there's this bayou that's right across the street, and that was like the end zone of where we could go and where we couldn't go. And so one morning when I was a kid, my brother had a friend over. We were outside playing. I was 2.5 years younger than them, so I was just the younger brother that just kind of followed around. I'm sure it was kind of annoying, but whatever they were doing, I was doing. And they decided to go across the bayou. And being the younger brother, I decided to follow them across the bayou. And so as we were walking, I don't even know the moment that it happened, but somewhere over across the bayou, I stepped on a beehive. So now there's different types of bees, and when you think of beehives, you think of them up in a tree, especially the cartoons. It's up in the tree and it's got honey and the bear climbs the tree. That was not this beehive. Wood bees make their hives on the ground. And so somewhere over there, unbeknownst to me at the moment, I stepped on a beehive. The reason we know that I was the one that stepped on it is because as we were walking, my brother's friend notices that I've got a bee that's stinging me. And he grabs it and pulls it off. And then another bee is on me. And then another bee. And then all of a sudden they realize that I'm covered with bees. Now my brother's friend, I think he got stung twice. My brother, I think he got stung 3 times. But I got stung 32 times that day. The reason that we know it was 32 is because when a bee stings you, it sacrifices their life. So it injects its stinger, and then you have to pull the bee off and the stinger off in order to get that thing out. And so when we finally got back to our house, one by one, 32 different bee stingers came out. And they took this hydrogen peroxide, like solution stuff, I don't know exactly what it was, like this paste stuff, and they stuck it on every single one. I was a little traumatized by bees on that day in that moment. And so now still, like when there's a wasp flying around, I'm like, whoa, did anybody see that? There's a wasp somewhere in this vicinity, I heard it. And I think probably that moment in time, those bees made my experience so profound in that moment that now everything about when I look at a flying thing, it's through the lens of that experience. Oftentimes in life, we have these experiences with certain groups of people, certain moments in time, and those travel with us over the course of our life. When we think of Christianity in the United States of America, there was a big study that was done in 2007. It's called Unchristian. And it was studying why the United States of America was kind of moving away from what was always seen as this Christian nation. And one of the main driving factors that they came to decide as a result of this study was that the perception of Christians in the United States of America was going down, down, down. You've heard something like this, I'm sure, that when people described Christians, they would describe them as generally the same type of words. They would say they were hypocritical. They would say they were judgmental. They were bigots. They had all these terms that they used to describe Christians. And where did those terms come from? Somewhere along the way, they had an experience with someone who claimed to be a Christian, maybe was a Christian, but in their experience, the way that that person made them feel was so negative that it completely clouded their view, not just of that individual, but of Christianity as a whole. If you've got your Bible, I want you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 26. We're going to look at two primary texts today. We're going to look at the life of Peter. Peter was a guy who was bold. He was a guy who wanted to live for Christ. And we see early on what he thought that meant, how that translated into his actions. And then we'll see later on in his life how it was different. Matthew chapter 26, verses 50 through 52. Here's the scene. They're coming to arrest Jesus. Jesus knows what's about to happen. This is after the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knows he's about to be crucified, and so they show up. Judas has betrayed him. It says in Matthew chapter 26, verses 50 through 52, it says, "Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?'" Now, it's interesting, in the book of Matthew, he doesn't out who it was. He just says one of those that was there pulls out a sword and chops a guy's ear off. But in the book of John, John's like, yeah, it was Peter. That was the guy. Maybe John was like, do they think it was me? Just to clarify, that's the guy who actually did it. And you can imagine, if you're Peter in that moment, you see Judas betraying, you see these soldiers, you've always kind of had this conflict. You've known that Jesus was in this conflict that existed with the Roman government, that somehow they knew that Jesus was the Messiah, which in their mind meant he was going to overthrow the world, he was going to become the king. And so when this is happening, the knee-jerk reaction of Peter is, I'm just going to pull out my sword and I'm going to start fighting. Now, either Peter had really amazing aim or really terrible aim. It's unlikely he was aiming for the guy's ear, but that's what he hit. So probably things wouldn't have gone well had there actually been a fight. And what does Peter get from Jesus? Jesus turns to Peter and says, "What are you doing, man? Put the sword away." That Jesus says, Peter, don't you understand that if I wanted to, haven't you seen all the miracles? Haven't you been around me? If I wanted to, I could command a legion of angels to come down and stop all of this, and yet I choose not to do it. Peter's words to Jesus, Peter's words from Jesus were, "Put down your sword and instead take up your cross." That was his message over and over and over again. Take up your cross, follow me, die to yourself, follow me. When Jesus shows back up after his resurrection, Peter had denied Christ, had turned away from him. And what does Jesus tell Peter he needs to go do? He doesn't say, okay, now gather an army. We're going to overthrow the country. No. He says, feed my sheep. He says, take up your cross, live for me, feed my sheep, love my people. Now, at the end of Peter's life, we're going to look in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. While you're turning there, in a culture that's really tense right now, we've been doing an entire series where we're talking about how do we combat culture. When a culture is turning more and more, not just away from biblical truth, but is actually becoming anti-Christian in some facets, what do we do? What's our response with that? How do we as Christians find our place in a culture that more and more disagrees with biblical truth? Well, throughout Scripture, we see this pattern that we, as Christians, are meant to represent Jesus. In 2 Corinthians, it says that we're supposed to be a sweet aroma of Christ, that how we live should be this sweet aroma so that people around us take note. Later on, a couple chapters later, it says that we're supposed to be ambassadors, that we are representing Jesus every day with who we are, with how we live, that our thoughts, our words, our actions, they should be so distinctive that people around us take note and say, what is different about that person? I office over in our D building, and right next to me is a guy named John Barksdale. John Barksdale is what the Dos Equis guy had to have been come up with as from. He is the most interesting man in the world. I one time went on a staff trip where I roomed with John Barksdale, and I really thought at the end of this trip that I would come away disappointed because the myth wasn't quite as good as the actual man, and total opposite. I walked away saying, wow, he's way cooler than I thought he was going into it. Like, he knows all about plants and all about animals, and you ask him anything about like history or anything about paintings or anything about, hey, what's that type of flower? He knows what it is and where it's from. But John also has this aroma, like he smells like mahogany and leather-bound books. Like he just smells good all the time. And so when he walks down a hall, like you can walk into a hall after John has walked by, you're like, John Barksdale was here. I smell that. But it's like an amazing smell. Like you want to be like John, and that smell is this attractive, good smell. There's some other people that have some bad aromas that you don't want to be around those people, but he has an aroma that is this great aroma. As Christians, we are to be an aroma for the world around us for Christ. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 says this, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against you." So throughout the first couple chapters in 1 Peter, here's what he's doing. He's writing to a bunch of different churches in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. It's a letter that would get passed around amongst them. It's primarily Gentiles that are getting this, but he uses a lot of visual imagery from the Old Testament to connect these new Christians to Israel. He's trying to connect them to help them to understand that a lot of the things that we see in the Old Testament, that they're applying to you right now. So in the Old Testament, what happens in multiple different situations is that God's people become exiles, that they're no longer in the promised land, no longer in the place that God has for them. They're away from home. They're sojourners in a distant land. And God commands them that while they're there, how they're living, that they're putting on display for the world what it means to live for God. So Peter is calling on them to do this same thing. He's saying, you right now are sojourners. You're in exile. Now, here's what didn't make sense. Most of these people are living in the town that they grew up in. Like, this is where they are from. So when he's saying that you are exiles, he's connecting a spiritual kingdom to their earthly condition. He's saying you might be from whatever town you're in. That might be where you currently live. That might be even where you grew up. But you as a Christian, if you are a Christian, your first and foremost identity before anything else in your life is Christ. And as a result of that, recognize that as a citizen of heaven, you are living in a home that is not your home. Essentially saying, don't get too comfortable because where you are is not where you will eventually be. He's got this eternal perspective, this eternal mindset, and he's saying that where you are right now, you are in exile. That's not your future home. And so while you are there, recognize that the way that you live, you are this ambassador. You are setting an example. Who you are representing is more important than just where you grew up or where you're from. So he says, I urge you as sojourners, exiles, abstain from the passions of the flesh. Why? He wants them to live a life that looks different. Verse 12, he says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of their visitation. That word honorable in the Greek is interesting because it says beautiful in deeds. That's another way to translate it. So he's saying that your actions, how you go about living your life, should be so honorable, so beautiful in action, beautiful in deeds, that it causes the people around you to take note. And then what does he go on to say? He said that as a result of that, as a result of their actions, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of the visitation. That when Jesus comes back, when they eventually, after this life, end up in a conversation with Jesus, that they are believers. Why? Because they took note of their lifestyle. That simply by living a life that pursues God, living a life that is holy, living a life that is set apart and different, it gives off such an aroma that the world around takes note and says, give me some of that. Verse 13, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Now, here's where it starts to get a little bit tense. It's tense for anybody to read that line, be subject to. Peter's saying, I want you to willingly choose to be subject to the government, the authority above you. Now, that's hard in any context, but in this context, it was especially difficult because the emperor at this time was a guy named Nero. Nero was a crazy guy. He was a crazy guy who hated the Christians. And so Nero was doing everything he could to stamp out Christianity. And yet, what is Paul saying? He's saying that you need to be subject to the authorities that are above you. Now, a little bit of context. He's not saying that if the government authorities are asking you to do things that are unbiblical or immoral according to a godly standard, that that's okay. We see throughout Scripture examples where they tell them to stop doing things, government entities do, but what they're telling them to do is in direct contradiction to the Word of God. And as a result of that, they choose to do what God has called them to do anyway. And so there are moments in time when the government gets outside the authority of God's word and the authority of what God has declared good and right and wrong, when the government steps outside of that, then yes, you can pursue holiness despite what the governor says, despite what the government says. But in general, so long as it's not outside the bounds of what God has commanded you to be and to do, obey. Obey willingly. Now, that's hard to do in any situation. It's hard to do for anybody when you have an authority figure to willingly choose to obey that person. Now, that last part of that verse gives it a little explanation as to why. What's the point of a government? That God has put government in control throughout mankind's history for a reason and for an intention. The government in general, they're supposed to praise people who are doing good and stop people who are doing evil and bad. Now, any government that does not do that over the course of time will eventually fall apart. If they start doing the opposite, if they start praising actions that are evil and putting down actions that are good, what's going to happen to that nation? It's going to fall. It's not going to last very long. I mean, think of that with just some general premises. If it starts saying, okay, stealing is good, murder is good, being loving is bad, it doesn't take long before anarchy exists and that whole thing falls apart. And so in general, if the government, any good government is going to praise things that are good and stop things that are evil, if we, as believers, as Christians, are living lives that are holy, then eventually even the government is going to take note. It goes on in verse 15. It says, "For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." That word servants in Greek is doulos. It's the same word as slave. That you're willingly submitting to God, and by living for God, what are we called to do? The answer to the big question in culture of how should I respond, what should I do, is in this verse right here. "For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you put to silence doubters." By doing good, you change the narrative that people have of Christianity. By doing good, without having to pick up a sword, by living a life that is different, it is the greatest tool we have for the kingdom of God. You want to maximize your impact on this life for eternity, do it with your lifestyle. Do it with a lifestyle that pursues God and looks different. Verse 16, he kind of summarizes it. He says, "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." Verse 17, "Honor everyone." It doesn't just say honor people who are nice, honor people who are good, honor people who you agree with. It says that we are to honor everyone. Say it with me, we're to honor everyone. That's hard. That's not easy. It's easy to honor people who are worth honoring, who deserve honor, but that's not what we're called to do. We're supposed to honor everyone. We're supposed to love the brotherhood. Who's that talking about? The church. That inside the church, when someone who's a guest, who's never been here before, when they walk into this place, they should have such a profound experience that they walk away saying, "Man, I don't know that I believe everything they believe." I mean, some of what they were talking about seems a little bit crazy, but man, they were so nice. They were just obnoxiously nice. They were so friendly and so welcoming and so warm. And I saw the interactions that they had with one another. And guess what? They were so genuine. That I might not agree with everything they say, but I can't disagree with who they were. Because wow, it's almost like when you go to a Chick-fil-A. I mean, if Chick-fil-A has 30 cars in the drive-thru, and you look at a different drive-thru and it's got 3 cars, it's a coin flip. You're like, they're so fast at Chick-fil-A, and then I'm gonna get in the line and they're always gonna be obnoxiously nice every single time. That the branding of Chick-fil-A means that you go to anywhere in the country, you see Chick-fil-A and you're like, I mean, the chicken's gonna be good, the drive-thru is gonna be fast, and they are gonna be really, really nice to me. Like anything I say, they're gonna say, "My pleasure." I sometimes try, in the back of my mind, I say, how many times can I get this person to say "my pleasure"? And so I'll just say, "Hey man, thank you so much." And then I'll give my order, and they'll say, "Man, thank you so much." And then I'll try and throw another thank you, because every time you say thank you, they say "my pleasure." Consistent. What if you go to any church that's underneath the banner of Jesus, and people would walk away and say, "Man, those people are nice. Those people are loving." Like I'm in their parking lot and I cut somebody off accidentally and took their parking space, and they didn't honk at me. They didn't get out of their car and come chase me. Like they just gave this friendly wave and were so genuine and nice. Like I was walking up to a door and they opened a door for me. I looked lost, deer in the headlights, and someone said, "Hey, can I help you find something?" That's what the church should be. Love the brotherhood, fear God. It's not saying fear God of be scared of God, although he's worthy to be scared of. It's saying fear God as in reverence and awe. It's an eternal perspective. It's saying God, the creator of the universe, holds this life together, and every heartbeat and every breath is a gift I don't deserve. And so I'm going to live in a way that honors and respects and fears and has awe of God. And then the last phrase says, honor the emperor. Now, this is different than verse 13. Verse 13 is talking about your action. That, hey, you're supposed to submit. You're supposed to do what they tell you to do. In some ways, that's pretty easy. You can say, okay, I'm going to follow the rules where I'm supposed to follow the rules. I get it. But this one's harder because honor is about your attitude. If you've got kids, there's a big difference with your kids between saying that you're sorry and actually meaning that you're sorry. Like that happens all the time. Your kids get into a fight, say, hey, y'all need to go apologize to each other. And they'll do the same, hey, sorry, and they'll walk away. And you're like, no. I want you to come try it again, and I want you to say it like you mean it. Attitude. So it's not just that I'm going to obey the authority above me. I'm going to do it in a way that honors them. Now, again, this was in the time of Nero. Did he deserve honor? From an earthly perspective, absolutely not. And so who would give the biggest shock and surprise to honor someone than the people that deserve to hate him the most? There's a fascinating documentary that exists right now on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. I saw it a few months ago with my wife. It's an interesting thing. But of all the things that they talked about, there was this chart that they showed that was this kind of visual graphic, but it showed where we were in 1994. And it shows that for the most part, kind of as a society, we were somewhat in the middle. So in 1994, we looked like this. This is the political polarization. So you've got Republicans on one side, you've got Democrats on the other side, but for the most part, we're kind of somewhat there in the middle. But here's what's happened, largely because of social media. From 1994 to 2017, here's what happened. You compare the two, here's 2017, drastically different. And part of that is because of the thing called confirmation bias. So social media companies, the way that they get paid is by keeping you engaged with their product for as long as possible. The same is true for Facebook and Instagram and YouTube or you name it. If you're not paying for it, then somebody's getting paid somewhere. And so because you're not paying for the service, they are having advertisers pay for you to watch. And so the whole goal of any social media company is how long can we keep them engaged? And you are more likely to stay engaged if you are seeing content that you agree with. So there's an algorithm that exists behind every social media company that when they give you recommendations, whether it's on your feed or you're watching a video on YouTube and there's some recommendations on the side, when they are giving those recommendations, it's based off of all the research they have on you, that the digital footprint that you have left over all the different aspects of the internet. They know you in some ways better than you know yourself, and they use that profile to determine what are the things that we can use to suck this person in. And so here's what happens slowly, is people start watching more and more content that the algorithm has determined you agree with this content, and so they start seeing more and less of content from people that they disagree with. Now, here's the dangerous thing that happens as a result, and I'm sure that you've seen it. You've probably seen it in conversations, maybe at your own dinner table. Maybe you've seen it in conversations with friends. You've definitely seen it on social media in the comment section. That we've become so polarized, so opposite as a culture, that it's not just that there's any civil discourse where people say, hey, I disagree with that. You know, I see your point, but I disagree with that. And so I think this is a better point. It's just become bitter hatred. I mean, like people genuinely hate each other. I've seen comment sections sometimes where it's family members and like they start going back and forth and we've all done it. You're like, oh man, this is gonna be good. I'm just gonna scroll and watch. Like I'm gonna check tonight. I don't even really know this person. I haven't seen him in 25 years, but man, this is entertaining. And the things that people say to one another are terrible. In the midst of a culture is becoming more and more bitterly opposed to each other, more and more unable to have civil discourse, what then is our place? What should we as believers look like? Every day I drive my now 6 and 8-year-old to school, and in the morning it's interesting the type of conversations that they have, because they're at that age where they both hate being wrong, and really like to be right. But something about that age, they don't just hate being wrong and like to be right, they like to prove the other person that they're wrong for no good reason whatsoever. And so oftentimes in the morning, there will be a comment that one of them makes that's purely an opinion. Something like, this is one that happened this week, one of them was looking out the car window and said, "Man, it's foggy today." And the other one said, "No." And I'm like, "Hey, why do you not think it's foggy?" Because it's been foggier than that before. It's not really that foggy. This isn't that foggy compared to really foggy days. So would you agree that it's somewhat foggy right now? I mean, it's sort of kind of foggy. So then she could say it's foggy, and you don't have to say no, do you? You could just say, okay. Or maybe even if you disagree with her opinion, you could say, I don't know that this is quite as foggy as it has been, but your response was just rude. And so we have this conversation over and over because one of them will state a fact. It could be something like, "My favorite animal is a cheetah." And the other one will say, "No, that's a terrible animal. There's so many better animals than that. Your choice is wrong." And you're like, guys. Yeah. And so this conversation happens over and over and over again, where here's the phrase that we say to nauseam: being kind is not something that you try to do. Being kind is who you are. So our kids hear that a lot because you'll say, "Okay, your response was not kind. I need you to try that again. I don't like what you said. I want you to try it again." And I say, "I'm trying to be kind." One of them says that a lot. "I'm trying to be kind. Sometimes I'm just not." I say, "No, that's not a good answer. You don't just try to be kind. Being kind is who you are." I want to raise a kid that is a kind person, that loves God and loves others. And here's where it's crazy. I care far more about my kids being kind than I do about them being cool, than I do about them being popular, than I do about them, all the other attributes that they might say, "That's what I want to be." Hey, yeah, those are good, but if you are a jerk, none of that stuff matters. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14, it says, "Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord." John chapter 13, verses 34 through 35, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." That your lifestyle, by loving others unconditionally, by honoring people that don't deserve honor, by honoring people that you disagree with, by honoring people that you think are wrong, by honoring people who have wronged you, by loving them despite all of that, that is what causes people to take note and will cause them to say they love Jesus. The growth of Christianity is a fascinating thing to look on a chart, because if you go back to the very beginning, it's just a small handful of people that in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, church is about 3,000. And then it just explodes and it takes over the world. And how does it do that? Like if you were going to study history and say, what causes movements? Oftentimes, movements are caused by violence or warfare. They're not caused by simply ideas of a group of people. And everything about this movement was radically different than the movements that we'd seen before, because they weren't brought together by any one thing. It wasn't all men or all women or all rich people or all poor people or all of one certain type of race. It was all people from all different backgrounds. And the one thing that brought them together was what? A love of Jesus. You flash forward to the year 250. In the year 250, there's 1.2 million Christians in Rome. Rome has 60 million Christians. Rome is the size of about 60 million. There's 1.2 million Christians. Flash forward 50 years to the year 300. There's now 6 million Christians in Rome. Flash forward another 50 years, the year 350, and there's 33 million Christians of a population of about 60. So in the blink of an eye, Christianity goes from being this small group of people to dominating culture, dominating the world. Now, Christianity, Constantine chooses to make it no longer illegal. He doesn't actually make Christianity the official religion of Rome. People falsely say that all the time. He just made it no longer illegal, but he was simply recognizing what had already happened. That edict did not change the reality that most of Rome had already become Christian. What happened? If you look at the growth of Christianity, historians will point back to plagues. They'll point back to natural disasters. They'll point back to moments in time where the world starts falling apart, and the response of the Christians is what makes the difference. Listen to Dionysius of Alexandria. He was a bishop in Alexandria, and in 260 he writes this. He said, most of the Christians in our city showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of others. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending their every need, helping and comforting them, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pain. Most likely the plague that hit at that time was smallpox. We're not 100% sure, but that's what a lot of medical historians think. And so what would happen when that hit a city, the first group of people that would leave would be the doctors. They would say, if you catch this, you die, so I'm just getting out of here. It would kill, if it hit a city, about 30%, sometimes 50% of that city. And one of the great plagues at that time, they found a mass grave of 70,000 people, approximately. A mass grave, 70,000. Now, they only start putting bodies in mass graves when they've run out of everything else. It was killing so many people, they couldn't keep up. And so Christians at that time are looking at people that are sick and dying. The government would tell you that if your family member got sick, put them out of your house, otherwise they're going to infect everybody else. And so Christians at that time are looking at a government that has turned on its people, family members that has turned on its people, and Christians say, okay, we're supposed to love others. That's the commandment of Jesus, so what do? And so they lived out the gospel. They started to take in the sick. They started to take in the dying, oftentimes costing them their own life, but they didn't care. It's not that they didn't care. It's they cared more about loving their neighbor than they did about their own health and well-being. Listen to what, this is Emperor Julian, Christians called him Julian the Apostate. He was the emperor of Rome in 360 AD. Here's what he writes. He says, the impious Galileans, that's his word for Christians, support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our poor lack aid from us. That he acknowledges that these Christians that he hates, that not only are they taking care of themselves, they're taking care of everybody else too. So what do? In a culture where everything feels like it's flipped upside down, I think our response is the same that Peter's response, how it changed. That Jesus said to Peter, hey, put down the sword, take up your cross. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be politically involved. I'm not saying that we should be doormats. I'm not saying that we should step away entirely from the conversation. I'm saying that when we have the conversation, when we are involved, the attitude by which we as Christians are engaged must look different. That it's not about me, it's about him. My story might be about me, but it's not for me. That's the call of Christians. And so how I engage people, whether it be online, whether it be in person, here's the reality. In a few weeks, a big chunk of people are going to be disappointed in results that happen in the election. No matter which side you're on, you're going to be disappointed in one shape or another. And so how we respond should not be dictated on whether we're happy with the results or not. I don't get to choose the circumstances of my life, but here's what I do get to do. As a Christian, I can trust that God is sovereign in spite of everything, no matter what. And he has called me in this slice of space and in this slice of time to live a life that is holy. And if I will do that and pursue eternity, that is the difference that God has called on me to make in this earth.